Hi, this is Teresa Martin from Lower Cape TV, and welcome to this month's episode of Legislative Update. With me today is State Senator Julian and State Rep Sarah Peake. Welcome.
Thanks, Teresa.
Good to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have us all together again. Last month we were in deep budget weeds, right? And we couldn't even coordinate schedules to be here at the same time. So you're out of the weeds now? What's happening with the budget?
We're out of those weeds. We might be into new weeds, who knows? But where we are sort of in this continuum of the budget process that begins in January and carries right through to the 1st of July, the House has debated the budget, the Senate has debated the budget. Those two things don't exactly line up. There's lots of pieces that do line up perfectly, but there's lots of pieces that don't. So a conference committee has been appointed, 3 members from the House, 3 members from the Senate, and they are working furiously. They've got their pencils sharpened and their calculators out, and their staff is working furiously. And we hope next week we'll be called up, maybe on short notice, to vote on what's called the conferenced budget report, which is the budget that reconciles the differences between the House and the Senate.
I guess July 1st is 10 days away now, right?
It sure is. That's right. You wouldn't know it by the weather outside,
No.
but by the legislative cycle, you absolutely know that July 1st is 10 days away.
Is there anything that this region wants to be particularly aware of in the budget?
Well, there's a lot. So, I mean, first, the Senate budget really has prioritized Chapter 70 funding. So this Chapter 70 is the
Define
law.
this for people who don't know what
so
it is.
Chapter 70 is the law that governs the funding formula for public schools. So in the Senate budget, we funded Chapter 70 at the highest levels ever, including 100% reimbursement for the special ed circuit breaker, also high levels of funding for regional school transportation, and work to create, we started it last budget and we're continuing it, having funding targeted to rural schools, which includes Nauset, also includes island schools and Monomoy as well, to make sure they're getting some resources. So that was a big sort of important piece that we took leadership on. The House has really taken leadership on early education. So we tend to go back and forth, right?
And the only reason, for a brief few weeks, the House funded Chapter 70 funding at the highest level ever. And then the Senate came in, and then theirs is at the highest level.
Yeah.
So the good news for our kids and the districts is this little competition between the House and the Senate means that no matter what happens, we're seeing a record level of Chapter 70 funding. And what the Senate's done around regional school transportation and special ed circuit breaker funding, that in some ways is more impactful for our local districts than the base Chapter 70 funding because of the way the formula works. But because our schools are largely regional, except for Barnstable, I guess, and Sandwich, and because those buses travel great distances, that funding can be a budget buster for us locally, and to the degree that the state can step up and carry more of that burden, it really makes a difference to our communities.
We're watching that one, right?
That's right.
Another big piece that we prioritized is mental health, and really looking more broadly, and you'll hear more about work we're doing around transformation of mental health. But specifically in the budget, we sought to fund mental health at the highest levels ever around traditional funding sources.
Highest level theme going here.
We are in a broadly good economy right now. We're fortunate,
Right.
But also that I think for when you're in these sort of moments, you try to say, all right, where are places where we haven't done enough? And I think mental health is one of them. And so in the Senate budget, we established $10 million in new funding that's targeted to first an anti-stigma and anti-discrimination campaign, which will be $500,000, and then the remainder of that targeted around student loan forgiveness, around workforce. So if you're someone who is struggling with mental illness, especially here on the Outer Cape and the Lower Cape, finding access to a provider is really difficult.
Hard.
Now there's insurance problems we got to fix, but there's also a workforce piece, as in actually finding someone who is a provider.
I've heard horror stories of people in Provincetown, actually young people being told the closest place they can go is Fall River.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for a bed in a facility, you're going to Bridgewater, basically. So we're working on that. I think a lot of what we did, going back to the ed funding for a minute, is really setting the stage for the overhaul of the ed reform bill that's coming later. But before we delve into that, another piece in the budget, we've all read in the Cape Cod Times over the course of the last month or 6 weeks about nursing home closures.
I was just going to ask about that.
Right,
Yeah.
skilled nursing beds, even an assisted living center. So assisted living facility. So something that's in the budget that I'm sure is going to stick through to the end is a cash infusion, raising $30 million, which will allow the reimbursement rates to be raised for nursing homes, because so many of them here, they're dependent upon Medicare and Medicaid patients in effect, and those rates haven't gone up. All costs have gone up. So the situation that our skilled nursing facilities are facing is somebody can make more money pouring coffee at Dunkin' Donuts than they're making as an LPN working and caring for the most fragile of our society, our elderly, in one of these skilled nursing centers. So we're doing a big cash infusion of $30 million. And the other important piece is setting up a statewide commission, because the closures aren't unique to Cape Cod.
No,
they're happening all over, all across the Commonwealth. And the great news is Bill Bogdanovich, who runs Liberty Commons, has been asked to serve on the statewide commission.
Wow.
And he is a forward-thinking, ahead of the curve kind of guy. And it's really great that Cape Cod, and in particular, kind of the lower Cape, is going to have a seat at that table. So that's very important
That's
for us.
exciting.
And we were able to secure language around that commission that's really focused on geographically isolated communities, which is us, right?
Right.
Provincetown and Orleans, also Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard.
Right.
So having Bill appointed to that and making sure that the commission has a mandate that they've got to look at the special considerations that we have and why it's more challenging to run a skilled nursing facility in, say, a Provincetown than it says, than someplace on the mainland, if you will.
Right. Or how do we keep people within our communities as they age?
And age in place.
And near their families, because that's important also. They may no longer be able to live at home, but there are families and friends who still add an enrichment and, quite honestly, a mental health piece to their lives and their overall well-being. So, as Julian was talking, I just remembered we were also successful getting a piece in the budget. For years, there's been language that says when it comes to reimbursement rates that the islands, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, may be considered for a higher reimbursement. And in fact, they have been. This year, for the first time, baked into the budget was language, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and Provincetown. So there's a recognition that Provincetown has a geographic remoteness akin to those two islands.
Which is a big deal.
It is a big deal, right? We've been working on that for 2.5 years.
No, it hits so close to home when you know someone who wants to stay nearby, and their closest location's 2 hours away.
That's right.
Exactly. That's the real concern, right? And that if some of these nursing facilities close, as we're seeing, right, it's going to mean, actually, we had I had a constituent, I think he's your constituent too, who was going to be moved actually, in an assisted living facility that was closing, and was going to be moved off Cape. And he's 99 years old. I think he's going to be 100 in a few short weeks. Right. And to take someone, just to uproot them out of their community.
Such a disruption.
So we've got to do a better job on this. So this is, I think you're seeing in the budget, the first step in an investment here. But I think we've worked really hard to make sure that Cape Cod specific concerns are really at the table as we're having this conversation on skilled nursing.
That conversation is important because it sounds like it's also helped triggered, maybe for the first time, a real meaningful discussion about how do we address an aging population.
Yeah, that's right.
Across the whole Commonwealth, not just here.
Right. But Julian and I spend a large part of every day having a conversation about Cape Cod and our unique needs. In the upcoming Ed Reform Bill, we have spent hours speaking with our colleagues who chair the Joint Committee on Education, talking about what our challenges are around declining enrollment and there's a whole issue with the DY district and all of these challenges, and by what measure do we measure kids who are at the poverty level? Because if you think of that as 185% of the poverty level versus 145%, that's a difference of millions of dollars that'll flow to our schools or not flow to our schools. So those are just two examples of ways that our uniqueness here. There's going to be a major housing bill coming out. We're talking with the chairs of the Housing Committee and our leadership, he with the Senate President and me with the Speaker, about our need for affordable housing, but not just affordable housing, but workforce housing as well. Once again, Cape Cod's unique needs, and we're pretty lucky. We've got a good team with the rest of our brothers in the delegation to work on this.
And we've had this conversation a number of times recently about not just workforce housing, but about rental housing in general. Like we hear from older people who, they're in this hard place. They can't go. There's not senior housing. There's not rental housing. They've got a house they can't manage. And what happens?
Well, and I think we're at a moment where our towns are really, especially in the Outer Cape,
Yeah, they're stepping
are
up.
really stepping up.
Yeah.
So Provincetown's been a real leader on this. I mean, Provincetown's been on the forefront of affordable housing for a long time, but especially with the Harbor Hill project. You see Truro really getting some skin in the game with this Cloverleaf project, and now the purchase of the Walsh property, which is going to be 70 acres. We get to figure out what we're going to do with that. And then Wellfleet stepping up in a big way too. But what we need to make sure...
East
And
Ham,
East Ham, yep.
Brackett Road,
Brackett
and the
Road,
Tea
yeah.
Time
Yeah.
property. So suddenly, I think over the next 3 years, as these projects get developed, we're going to see a tremendous amount of housing, home ownership and rental housing, come on the market. And I hope and think that it's going to make a real difference.
But I think what we're trying to work to do in this housing conversation, which is being driven by sort of Greater Boston, right? Greater Boston's
Yes.
economy is booming. They haven't kept up with housing production. We've got a housing production problem too, but the factors are different, and the incentives that our communities are going to need, our small communities will need to have some further success here are different than that Boston conversation. And so that's what we're trying to sink our teeth in and say, all right, you got to look at rentals, for instance, right? We know there's people, a lot of people, right, who are living in affordable rentals, whose landlords just keep it affordable because they want to do the right thing.
Right.
I think you should be getting a property tax break for that. Well, you can't do it, right? You need state law to make sort of those incentives happen.
Or you have to do it town by town by town. Provincetown has done it. Wellfleet has sent legislation up like that. But that should be something that should be an easy, we choose to adopt chapter such and such, section such and such
Instead of piecemeal.
in the budget. Accessory dwellings is another thing, right? The traditional mother-daughter apartment, maybe an apartment over a garage. That's a way, because we have a ton of structures already built. It's not like we lack structures, but who's living in them, and how can we create some year-round housing out of some of the structures that already exist? Minimum disruption.
This is going to be the start of a very long conversation, I know.
That's right.
Well, we're actually into the part where we want to talk about what's coming up. And I know the other thing that's coming up is some climate discussions.
That's right.
You've got some work going on with that.
So this is a key issue, and Sarah can talk about a really exciting kind of project the House is leading on this. But broadly, we need to really step it up in our response to climate. And Massachusetts likes to be in the vanguard.
Yes.
We're losing a little bit of our position here. New York State actually just passed and is going to be signed into law this really significant commitment to eliminate carbon by 2050. I mean, it's very bold.
Right.
We're working to catch up, and Sarah's involved intimately in an effort in the House. We're trying to continue in the Senate our real commitment to really look at carbon pricing, but also to look more broadly about other opportunities where how do we just move to how do we move to get folks engaged with climate? I've got a bill around community empowerment that allows municipalities to buy into renewable energy projects, so folks can have some skin in the game. And there's some real exciting work that the House is doing on a proposal to help municipalities.
Yeah, that's right. So the Speaker has identified $1 billion over 10 years, so $100 million a year, to go to municipalities through a competitive grant process, really around climate resiliency. So whether that's redoing coastal dunes or hopefully not too many seawalls, because they're not terribly effective, but really looking at resiliency issues. So that's a great thing, but some of us also appreciate that you need the science side of things also. So there's a small group of us, my friend who's the rep from Gloucester, the rep from sort of the middle part of the state, the rep that represents Amherst, Dylan Fernandez from Falmouth, and I, we all got together in a huddle and we realized there used to be federal funding that came to the New England states. It was about $1 million a year, and it was divided among the 6 New England states. Well, that has been reduced by 60%, as you can well imagine. So we said, so how can we backfill some of this money? Well, if the Speaker's bill moves forward, we haven't talked to him about this yet. We have an appointment to go in and see him.
Give him a little advance notice here.
We'll see if he watches Lower Cape TV. But anyway,
we'll send him the link.
Mr. Speaker, maybe you're finding this out right now. We'll see. So what we're looking for is somewhere 3 to 5% of that $100 million a year, not for all of New England, but just for Massachusetts, to be administered through UMass Amherst through a competitive grant process. So organizations like the Center for Coastal Study, NOAA, WHOI, there's a big climate change program and science center at UMass Lowell. There's some work that they're doing in Gloucester and on the North Shore as well, so that there would be a source of funding through a grant process that organizations, we could continue to do the research so that when communities are looking to do climate resiliency, they're making educated and informed decisions, but it'll also inform things like what our policy needs to be regarding carbon reduction as we move forward.
And I think help help us have really tough conversations, with climate disruption.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have really tough conversations about how we live our lives. We live on a peninsula that's surrounded by water.
right.
And, we really need to and should be, and I think are prepared to be, like it or not, this is the world we're going to have to live in and deal with. And so how do we be on the vanguard of that? How do we have conversations and prepare and provide resources to our communities to have those conversations around resiliency, around maybe things where we can't maintain, and also do what we can in the broader fight around climate, around carbon reduction.
Right.
We are in the front lines here, and people forget
Like it or
that.
not.
We are.
Yeah.
I mean, we see it every winter, right?
Yeah.
We've got a brand new parking lot and a coastal dune built out at Herring Cove. It looks beautiful. I have to give a tip of the hat to the Cape Cod National Seashore for the work they've done. But every person I meet says, "Oh, it looks beautiful. Let's see how long it lasts."
Yes. Yeah.
Because erosion is something that we have grown accustomed to. But there's a great there's not only an environmental cost to that, but there's an economic cost. If our fragile barrier beach system if they get overwashed, and suddenly the front line to the mighty Atlantic is Pleasant Bay instead of that barrier beach, well, that's going to have a tremendous amount of financial consequences as well. And that's just one small example. We're seeing this in Ipswich. You see it in Scituate, all along the coastline.
I know we tend to focus on really important issues like housing and healthcare, but if there is no land here anymore, it all becomes a moot point.
That's right.
Yeah. On that cheerful note, we're actually out of time for today. Many more future-looking things to come. Once again, this is Teresa Martin from Lower Cape. Thank you for joining us for Legislative Update, and thank you to State Senator Julian Sear and State Rep Sarah Peake for joining us, and look forward to having you back again next month after there's a budget in place.
You got it, Teresa. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Teresa.
Thank you.